The moment Susanna Harper realized she was in love with Harvey Cooper was not the moment he returned her book, though that was the moment that cracked her open like a geode and showed her everything shining inside. It was the Tuesday before that, when she had watched him through her parlor window, standing in the middle of the rutted main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the late summer of 1879, arguing with old Pete Harmon about the proper way to treat a lame horse, and she had noticed that Harvey's hands moved when he spoke, great sweeping gestures full of conviction, and that even Pete, a man famous for never conceding a single point to anyone alive or dead, had eventually nodded and deferred to him. Susanna had been holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she had not noticed until the cup was empty and her fingers were chilled, and the street outside was quiet again, Harvey Cooper having walked away with his hat tipped back and his shoulders carrying that particular kind of ease that men who know themselves tend to carry. Caldwell in 1879 was a cattle town on the southern border of Kansas, and it was a town of considerable noise. The Chisholm Trail brought longhorns up from Texas, and they brought with them the dust and the bawling and the cowboys who drove them, men who arrived trail-worn and hungry, and ready for the kind of trouble that a cattle town was always willing to provide. There were saloons enough for that, and a sheriff named Roy Dupree who was competent in the way that practical men are competent, which is to say, he handled things that could be handled and looked the other way at things that could not. Susanna's father, the late Elias Harper, had been the town's only schoolteacher, and when he had died of a winter fever in January of that year, he had left Susanna the small house on the quieter end of Elm Street, his small but carefully curated library of 43 books, a modest savings that would last perhaps 18 months if she was careful, and the reputation of being a serious and educated woman. Susanna was 24 years old and had no intention of being pitied. She had applied to take over her father's position at the schoolhouse and had been hired, though not without the kind of prolonged deliberation from the town council that suggested several of them found the idea of a woman teaching children to be a theoretical possibility they had not yet made peace with. She was a good teacher. She was patient in the way that people who have genuinely loved learning tend to be patient, and firm in the way that people who have grown up in schoolhouses understand firmness to be necessary. And she had her father's books on the shelf above the fireplace in her parlor, and she read one every 2 weeks, which was the pace she had set for herself since she was 12. Harvey Cooper arrived in Caldwell in the first week of August of 1879. He was 27 years old, though he looked somewhere in the range of timeless that some men achieve, not old and not young but simply present and solid, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, which is to say brown with something of gold and green moving through it. He had ridden up from Texas with a small outfit of 8 men and a herd of just over 900 head of longhorn cattle, and he had delivered the herd to the cattle buyer at the stockyards on a Thursday morning and collected his pay and paid his men, and then, instead of riding back south or moving on to whatever came next, he had taken a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Eugenia Fitch, and he had stayed. The other cowboys moved on because cowboys do. They spend their money in the saloons and they sleep and they get restless and they ride out looking for the next drive or the next dollar or simply the next horizon. Harvey stayed. He helped old Pete Harmon with his horses, because Harvey had a gift with animals that went beyond training and into something closer to conversation. He repaired the fence behind the livery stable when he noticed it was failing. He sat on the porch of Mrs. Fitch's boarding house in the evenings and smoked a pipe and read, which was the thing that made Susanna first take real notice of him, because men in Caldwell who sat quietly in the evening and read were not common, and she had walked past the boarding house on her way back from the schoolhouse and seen him there with a battered volume held at an angle to catch the last of the light, and she had wondered what he was reading. She found out on a Saturday in the second week of August, when he came into the mercantile while she was there buying flour and lamp oil, and he was asking the proprietor, a round man named Gerald Tuck, whether there were any books to be had in town. Gerald Tuck laughed the way men laugh when they find a question charming in its naivety. "Books," he repeated, as though Harvey had asked for a particular variety of tropical fruit. "Can't say we stock much in the way of books, friend. There's a Bible in the back if you're looking to get right with the Lord." "I have a Bible," Harvey said without offense. "I was thinking something else. A novel, maybe. History." Susanna had the flower in her arms and the lamp oil on the counter, and she had not intended to speak. She was not a woman who inserted herself into conversations, but the words came out of her with the ease of something that had been waiting. "My father had a library," she said. "I have 43 books on my shelf. You're welcome to borrow one if you'd like." Harvey Cooper had turned and looked at her, and that was the first time she had seen his face close enough to register the particular quality of his attention, which was the kind of attention that made people feel they were the only thing in the room worth looking at. Not in a flattering, performative way. In a genuinely curious way, as though she were a problem he found interesting. "That's a generous offer," he said. "I'd hate to impose on someone I haven't met. You repaired Pete Harmon's fence and talked sense into him about his gelding," Susanna said. "Pete Harmon has not listened to sense in 15 years. I think that earns you a book. I'm Susanna Harper." "Harvey Cooper," he said, and he shook her hand in the way that men who have been raised right shake hands, firmly and briefly and without drama. She had walked home and he had walked alongside her, and it should have been strange, but it was not strange at all. She showed him the shelf, and she watched him look at it the way she had always secretly hoped someone would look at it, with genuine consideration, scanning the spines with the focused deliberation of a man who understood that choosing a book was a real choice worth making. He had selected, after a long moment, a collection of Washington Irving's essays, the same volume her father had particularly loved, and Susanna had taken that as a sign of something, though she had not yet decided what. "How long do you need it?" she had asked. "A week, if that's all right. I read slow. I like to think about things." "That's exactly the right way to read," she had said, and he had smiled at her, not the broad, easy smile of a man trying to charm, but something quieter and more private, as though she had said something he had been thinking himself for a long time. He left with the book. Susanna stood at her door and watched him walk back up Elm Street, and she told herself firmly and clearly that he was a cowboy passing through, that he would move on as cowboys did, and that the warmth she felt watching him go was simply the pleasure of sharing books with someone who appreciated them, which was a pleasure she had not had since her father died. She was convincing herself of this all week. On the Sunday of that week, Caldwell held its regular church service in the small white building at the top of the hill, and Susanna sat in her usual pew near the middle, and Harvey Cooper came in and sat 3 pews behind her, which she knew because she heard his boots on the wooden floor, and because the back of her neck developed a particular awareness that she would not have been able to explain in scientific terms. After the service, in the yard outside while people visited and the Reverend Elias Marsh shook hands with his congregation, Harvey appeared at her elbow. "I'm halfway through," he said, without preamble, which she understood to mean the book. "Irving writes about the prairie the way I've always felt about it but never had words for." "Which part?" she asked, because she wanted to know. "The part about the silence," he said. "How the vastness of it doesn't make a man feel small so much as it makes him feel honest. Can't pretend to be anything out here that you're not. The land doesn't allow for it." She had thought about that for 3 days. She had thought about it while she was teaching her class the multiplication tables, and while she was grading their handwriting exercises, and while she was cooking her supper, and while she was lying in the dark trying to sleep. The land doesn't allow for it. There was something in the way he had said it that suggested he was not only talking about the land. On Wednesday, Mrs. Eugenia Fitch came to collect her youngest from Susanna's classroom at the end of the school day and stayed, as she often did, to talk, because Eugenia Fitch was a woman who loved information the way a river loves channels, finding every available path and moving along it with energy. She told Susanna that Harvey Cooper had been asking around about work, not cattle work, work in town. He had spoken to the blacksmith, Luther Grady, about whether he needed an extra hand. He had spoken to Gerald Tuck at the Mercantile. He had even apparently had a long conversation with Roy Dupree about whether the sheriff's office could use a deputy. "He's staying," Eugenia said, with the satisfied tone of a woman who has correctly predicted the weather. "You can always tell the ones who are staying. They start looking at the town like it's theirs." Susanna said something noncommittal and carried the thought home with her like a stone in her pocket, heavy and smooth and impossible to ignore. It was the following Saturday, a full week after he had borrowed the book, that Harvey Cooper appeared at her door. She heard the knock and opened it to find him standing on her porch in the afternoon light, holding the book out to her. He had cleaned up. His shirt was pressed, or as pressed as a man without a wife managed, and his boots had been blacked recently, and his hair had been cut, though not by anyone who did it professionally, which meant he had done it himself or asked one of the men at the boarding house to help. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made an effort. The book was the thing, though. She took it from him and noticed that it was heavier than she remembered, and when she opened it she understood why. There was a pressed flower on every page. Not the same flower. Every page had a different flower, flattened and dried and laid precisely between the leaves, so that the whole book had become a kind of garden, 100 different small blooms pressed against Irving's words. There were golden prairie wildflowers she recognized in delicate white, wood sorrel, and the bright lavender of ironweed and small yellow sunflowers, no bigger than a man's thumbnail, and the papery red of Indian paintbrush, and the pale pink of wild phlox, and things she could not name. Things that must have come from the fields and the creek banks and the edges of the road. Every variety of growing thing that the Kansas summer could offer. All of them collected and pressed and placed with an attention that would have required days of quiet effort. She stood in her doorway holding the book open, and she could not speak. "I know it's unusual," Harvey said, and his voice was careful, measuring her reaction. "I've been riding out in the mornings. There's a lot of good country between here and the creek, and the flowers were everywhere, and I thought." He stopped, cleared his throat. "I wanted to give something back with the book, something of equal value, and I know that words have been in those pages for a long time, but I thought maybe beauty could be added to them too." Susanna looked up from the book and looked at him. "Harvey Cooper," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "this is the most extraordinary thing anyone has ever done with a book." Something shifted in his face. Relief, she thought. The particular relief of a man who has done something that came from a tender and vulnerable part of himself and waited to see how it would be received. "You're not upset about the pages. The flowers are between the pages," she said. "Not on them. The words are all intact." She paused. "Did you press these yourself?" "Used a couple of flat boards and Mrs. Fitch's heaviest iron skillet," he said. "She thought I'd lost my mind." Susanna laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and genuine, and it surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him, because he smiled at the sound of it with something that looked like wonder. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came inside. He sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee the way her father had taught her, strong and dark, and she set the book carefully on the parlor shelf while the coffee was ready, and when she came back to the kitchen Harvey was looking around the room with that quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he saw the world, everything equally worth noticing, everything deserving of consideration. "Your father was the schoolteacher," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly been gathering information the same way she had been gathering information about him, through the channels that small towns provide. "He was," she said. "He died in January. The fever took him in about 4 days. She said it plainly because grief, after enough time, becomes a thing you can hold plainly, and she had had 7 months to practice holding it. He loved books more than anything. He used to say that every book was a conversation with someone smarter than him, which he said was the best kind of company because you could put it down and walk away when you'd had enough." Harvey smiled. My mother used to read to us. We had 3 books in the house, and she read all of them so many times we could have said the words alongside her. A Bible and a farmer's almanac, which she read like poetry, and a novel about a sea captain. I used to think the sea captain was a real person. What drew you to driving cattle? Started young, he said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. My father's farm in Texas went under when I was 16, drought taking everything it hadn't already taken. The trail was work, and work was what I needed to be. He said it without self-pity, the way men who have made practical peace with hard things speak about them. I've been doing it for 11 years. 9 drives, most of them up the Chisholm. And now, he looked at her steadily, I'm thinking about what comes after cattle driving, he said. A man gets tired of the trail eventually. He starts thinking about what it would mean to be somewhere specific instead of always in between somewhere. He paused. Luther Grady offered me steady work at the smithy. I have enough saved to buy land eventually. Susanna felt the warmth of this information spreading through her chest, the warmth of a man who is telling you his plans, and including in the manner of his telling a suggestion that he'd like those plans to be of interest to you specifically. She also felt the wariness of a woman who has been practical all her life and knows that hope can be its own kind of trouble. Tell me about one of the flowers, she said. In the book, tell me where you found one of them. He smiled slowly. The small yellow ones with the dark centers, about 3 pages from the end, he said. Those are from the bank of Cow Creek, about 4 miles east. I rode out there on a Thursday morning before the sun was full up. There's a bend in the creek where the cottonwoods come close over the water, and the whole bank is covered with those little flowers in the summer. It was quiet enough that I could hear the water moving over the rocks and a meadowlark somewhere in the cottonwoods, and I thought about that thing Irving wrote about honesty, about how you can't be anything but what you are out in the open like that. He picked up his coffee cup. I thought about what I was, he said. Right then, what I was a man who wanted to bring flowers from a pretty creek bank to a woman who had been kind enough to share her books with him. He met her eyes. So I did. Susanna set her own cup down with great care because her hands were not entirely reliable at that moment. Harvey, she said. Susanna, he said in the same tone, which was both an answer and a question. I would very much like to lend you another book, she said. He grinned, and it was the broad, easy smile she had not yet seen, the one that transformed his face entirely, and she thought, there it is. There is the rest of him that the quiet, careful version has been holding back. I was hoping you'd say something like that, he said. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Susanna had had since before her father's illness, and she did not let herself diminish that truth by being modest about it. Harvey began working at Luther Grady's smithy in the mornings, learning the work with the same methodical attention he gave to everything, and in the afternoons he was frequently visible around town, helping where help was needed, because that appeared to be his nature. He borrowed a second book from her shelf, this time a volume of poetry by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that had been Susanna's mother's, and he came back 2 weeks later with it pressed full of flowers again, different flowers from the first batch, flowers of early autumn that were smaller and more delicate, the last blooms before the turning of the season. He had taken to walking her home from the schoolhouse on the days when his work at the smithy finished early enough, and she had taken to the fact of this with an ease that told her something important about herself, namely that she had been lonelier than she had admitted since January, and that Harvey Cooper's company filled a specific shape of silence that she had not known she was carrying. They talked about everything. She was startled, regularly, by the breadth of what he had thought about and observed and questioned. He had read with the ferocity of a man who taught himself, which meant he had read broadly and sometimes wrongly and sometimes brilliantly, and he argued points with her with the confidence of someone who is not afraid to be corrected, which she found more attractive than she had anticipated finding it. He knew the names of a remarkable number of plants and stars and birds. He knew cattle in the specific intimate way that 11 years of driving them teaches, which is to say he knew their stubbornness and their surprising gentleness. And the exact pitch of sound that means a herd is content versus the sound that means trouble is coming. He knew the Chisholm Trail the way she knew her father's books, every landmark and waterhole and likely danger, and he described it to her with the vividness of a man describing something he loved and was ready to leave. "Do you miss it?" she asked one afternoon in late September when they were walking back from the schoolhouse, and the cottonwood leaves along the creek had turned yellow and were coming loose in the wind, drifting across the road like pieces of old letters. "Parts of it," he said honestly. The sky on night watch, the sound a herd makes when it's settled and moving right, the way the land changes mile by mile coming up through Indian territory. "You see things on the trail that you don't see any other way." She nodded. Indian territory was a subject she thought about sometimes, the land below the Kansas line where the 5 civilized tribes had been relocated after forced removal, a reality of the West that people in cattle towns like Caldwell tended to discuss primarily in terms of trail access and grazing rights, which was a narrowness she found troubling. "Were the men you drove with respectful of the territory?" she asked. "Some," he said carefully. "Some were not. I had arguments about it more than once. A man gets it in his head that because he's moving through fast it's not really anyone's home, which is a comfortable lie." Paused. "I've met Cherokee men who spoke 4 languages and could discuss philosophy the way you discuss weather, and I've met cowboys who thought them savages, and the comparison said a lot more about the cowboys than about anyone else." Susanna looked at him with something that felt like the final piece of a puzzle settling into its place. She had been building a picture of him from fragments, from things observed and things said, and this was a piece that she had been waiting to find without knowing she was waiting. A man who saw clearly, a man who applied his own intelligence to the injustices around him and arrived at honest conclusions. "My father used to say," she said, "that the most dangerous thing a person can learn is that certain other people are fully human, because once you know it, you can't unknown it, and then you have to actually think about what's been done." "Your father sounds like he was a good man," Harvey said. "He was an extraordinary one," she said, and felt the familiar ache of it. "He would have liked you." Harvey was quiet for a step or two. "Would he have approved of me walking his daughter home?" he asked, and there was something in the question that was careful and deliberate, a man checking the walls of a room before he decides to trust the floor. Susanna considered this. "He would have asked you 20 questions about what you'd read recently and what you thought about it," she said. "And then he would have invited you to dinner and argued with you about something for 3 hours and then said you were welcome any time." Harvey smiled at the road ahead. "I'd have liked that," he said quietly. "Harvey," she said, because she was a woman who had learned from her father the value of being direct, "what are your intentions toward me?" "I ask not to be forward, but because I find ambiguity uncomfortable, and I prefer honest conversation to guessing." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood on the side of the road with the cottonwood leaves drifting around them and Caldwell visible in the middle distance, its water tower and church steeple, and the distant sound of the smithy's hammer providing a frame for the moment. "My intentions," he said, looking at her with the full weight of that particular quality of attention that she had first noticed and never stopped noticing, "are to continue walking you home from the schoolhouse for as long as you'll allow it. To borrow every book on your shelf if you'll let me, because reading them gives me reasons to talk to you about what I'm reading, to learn this town well enough to be worth something in it. And eventually, if you are willing and if I've proved myself to your satisfaction, to ask you a very specific question." He paused. "Is that an acceptable answer?" "It is a very good answer," she said. And they walked the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that 2 people build between themselves when they have said enough and the unsaid things are pleasant. October arrived with cold mornings and clear light, and the particular beauty of the Kansas plains in autumn, which is a beauty that does not announce itself, but simply is, enormous and golden and smelling of dry grass and coming cold. Harvey had by this time borrowed 4 books from Susanna's shelf, and each one had come back pressed full of flowers, and the 4 volumes now sat on the shelf with their spines slightly thickened by the pressed blooms inside them. And Susanna sometimes took them down in the evenings and turned the pages slowly, looking at each flower and thinking about where it had come from, because Harvey always told her. He always described the place and the morning and what he had been thinking about, and she had begun to understand that the flowers were not decoration. They were a record. A man who could not yet say everything he felt had been saying it in the only language he could manage, which was the language of early morning rides to creek banks and meadows, the language of careful hands selecting small beautiful things from the earth and bringing them home. On the 3rd Saturday of October, there was a dance at the town hall, because Caldwell held a dance at the end of every month during the good weather season, and October was the last of it before winter made such things impractical. Susanna went because she always went, because her father had believed that community was built in the small, regular gatherings of ordinary people, and she had inherited this belief. She wore her blue dress, the one with the cream collar that her friend Clara Whitfield had helped her make in the spring, and she put her hair up in the way that took longer but looked better, and she walked to the town hall feeling the cold of the October night and the particular anticipation of a woman who has no settled reason for anticipation, but feels it anyway. Harvey was already there when she arrived, standing near the far wall talking to Luther Grady and Roy Dupree, and he was wearing a jacket she had not seen before, clean and dark, and his hair was properly cut this time by someone who knew how to do it. He saw her come in and excused himself from the conversation with the unhurried ease of a man who has decided where he is going and sees no reason to rush or hesitate, and he crossed the room to her. "You look beautiful," he said, simply and directly, without preamble. She felt the warmth of it all the way down. "You got your hair cut properly," she said. "Mrs. Fitch did it," he said. "She said the way I'd been managing it was an embarrassment to her establishment." He offered her his arm. "Will you dance with me?" She took his arm. "I should warn you that I am an honest dancer, which is to say I am adequate and no more." "I'm worse than adequate," he said cheerfully. "We'll match each other." They danced, and he was, in fact, a worse dancer than she was, something she found completely endearing, because he danced with concentration and genuine effort, and a complete absence of self-consciousness that made him a pleasure to dance with regardless of technique. He led her through 2 sets with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and she laughed twice at moments when they both made the same wrong step simultaneously and ended up in imperfect unison, and the laughing felt easy and necessary, the way laughter feels when you are with the right person. Between the sets, they stood by the window and drank the sweet tea that Mrs. Whitfield and her committee had provided, and Clara Whitfield appeared at Susanna's elbow with the expression of a woman who has been wanting to have a conversation for several weeks. Clara was Susanna's closest friend in Caldwell, a year younger and married to James Whitfield, who ran the hardware store, and she had opinions about everything and shared them freely, which was a quality Susanna valued. "Harvey Cooper," Clara said, shaking his hand with the directness of a woman who wastes no time. "Clara Whitfield. I've been hearing about you for 2 months, and I thought it was time I put a face to the name." "Good things, I hope," Harvey said. "Mostly," Clara said, with the candid smile that was her particular specialty. "Susanna tends to be careful about what she says, so mostly what I've heard is that you read and that you've been useful to people, and that you have a way with horses, all of which are excellent qualities." She glanced at Susanna with the look of a friend who is communicating an entire conversation in a single expression. "I hope your intentions are serious." "Clara," Susanna said. "They are," Harvey said, meeting Clara's eyes without flinching. "They are entirely serious." Clara studied him for a moment with the thoroughness of a woman who has been assigned by friendship to the task of judgment. Then she nodded. "Good," she said. "Then I'll leave you to it," and she walked away with the satisfied air of a woman who has accomplished something. "She's formidable," Harvey said. "She's my dearest friend," Susanna said. "She means well by all of it." "I know," he said. "I liked her immediately." He walked her home after the dance, through the cold October night with the stars sharp and plentiful overhead, and at her door he held her hand for a moment before she went inside, and looked at her with that look that she had learned to read, the one that meant he was thinking something he had not yet decided to say. She waited because she had learned that Harvey Cooper said things when he was ready and not before, and that the readiness was always worth waiting for. "The book I have now," he said. "Dickens, I'm almost done." "Great Expectations," she said. "It's a story about what we deserve and what we've been led to believe we deserve and how the two things can be entirely different," he said. "I keep thinking about that." "What do you think you deserve, Harvey?" He was quiet for a breath. "I think I deserve a chance to earn the life I want," he said, "and I think I'm in the right place to try for it." He squeezed her hand once and let it go. "Good night, Susanna." "Good night," she said, and went inside, and stood with her back against the closed door in the dark for a full minute, feeling her heart beat with an insistence that she supposed had always been the body's way of announcing things the mind had not yet caught up to. November brought the first real cold, and with it the particular compression of winter in a small town, when the world becomes smaller and the indoors becomes everything, and the people you share the indoors with become more important than ever. The school continued, because Susanna kept it going through weather that would have provided other teachers with ample excuse, and Harvey continued at the smithy, which was warm work in cold months, and they continued their evenings, which had become something agreed upon without being formally agreed upon, the way the best arrangements between two people tend to work. He would come to her house 2 or 3 evenings a week after supper, and they would sit in her parlor by the fire, and sometimes they would each read their separate books in companionable silence, and sometimes they would talk for hours about everything that occurred to them. And sometimes Susanna would read aloud from whatever she was currently reading because she had a good reading voice, and he liked to hear it. He always left at a proper hour, because neither of them had any interest in providing the town's gossips with material, and because there was something they were each being careful about, a pacing that felt right and right and right at every stage. He told her about his family in more detail as November went on. His parents had both died, his father from a fall when Harvey was 20 and his mother from a cancer 2 years after that. He had a sister named Louisa who was married in San Antonio with 3 children, and he sent her money when he had it and letters that she said were too short, which he acknowledged was a fair criticism. He had been engaged once, briefly, at 22, to a girl in Abilene whose name was Meredith, and the engagement had ended by mutual honest agreement when it became clear that they wanted different lives, and had been too young and too hopeful to see it clearly at first. He said this without bitterness, with the clear-eyed understanding of a man who has processed a thing properly. Susanna told him about her own life, the childhood in this same town, the books that had been her primary company, the particular loneliness of being a serious girl in a place that did not always know what to do with serious girls. She told him about the one young man who had courted her at 19, a merchant's son from Wichita who had been handsome and dull in equal measure, and about the year she had spent in Lawrence at a teaching seminary, which had been the most intellectually alive year of her life, and which had given her a taste for the kind of conversation that was hard to find afterward in Caldwell. Until now, she thought, but did not say. On the last Sunday of November, Harvey came to her house in the afternoon with the Dickens volume tucked under his arm, returned as always with its new garden of pressed flowers inside. But this time there was something in his manner that was different, a containment, like a man who is holding something carefully, and he sat down at the kitchen table and set the book between them and looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart dropped the way hearts do when people begin sentences that way. "All right," she said. "I've been talking to a man named Davis about a piece of land 4 miles north of town," he said. 80 acres along the creek with a small house on it that needs work. Good grazing land. He's selling it for a price I can manage if I put what I've saved against it and work the smithy through the winter. He folded his hands on the table. I'm buying it, I've decided. The feeling that had dropped came back up again, warmer than before. That's wonderful, she said. The house needs a lot of work, he said. It's rough, but the bones are solid. He met her eyes. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I am not a man who is passing through. I want to be clear about that. I'm here. I'm staying. I'm planting myself in this ground and growing something. He paused. And I'm telling you because you are the reason that Caldwell specifically is where I want to be. Susanna felt the full weight and warmth of that. Harvey, she said, I'm not asking you anything yet, he said. I want the land and the house first. I want to have something real to offer, but I want you to know why I'm doing it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had initiated a touch, and she felt him go still beneath it in the way that people go still when something they have been hoping for happens. I know why you're doing it, she said, and I am very glad of it. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment with the winter light coming through the kitchen window and the fire in the other room making its sound and everything feeling, for once, exactly as it should. He bought the land on the 15th of December, and the deed was recorded at the county office, and Harvey Cooper became a landowner in Caldwell, Kansas, which was a thing he had not been before and which fit him, Susanna observed. The way a good hat fits a man who has always worn one but has only just found the right one. He began working on the house on weekends, because the smithy work continued through the week, and sometimes on Saturdays Susanna would ride out with him in the cold to see the progress, and they would walk through the rough rooms while he explained what he was going to do with each of them. The window he was going to repair, and the floor he was going to sand, and the porch he was going to rebuild. And she would make suggestions that he received with genuine consideration, and sometimes adopted and sometimes argued against, and always thanked her for. Christmas in Caldwell was a modest celebration, a church service and a community dinner at the town hall, and the exchange of small gifts among friends and neighbors. Harvey gave Susanna a book, not one of hers borrowed and returned, but one he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita and received by mail, a slim volume of natural history focused on the plants of the Kansas plains, illustrated with careful engravings of the flowers that grew along the creek banks and across the prairie. She opened it at the table of the town hall dinner with Clara and James Whitfield watching, and she could not speak for a moment because it was the most perfectly chosen gift she had ever received. Inside the front cover he had written, in his careful, deliberate hand, "For Susanna, so you can name every flower I bring you. With great affection, Harvey." She had brought him a gift, too, a pocket almanac for 1880 that she had asked Gerald Tuck to specially order, and a pair of good leather gloves for working outdoors in the cold. He received the almanac with delight, paging through it immediately with the focused interest of a man who has always loved almanacs, and the gloves he pulled on and flexed his hands, and said they fit perfectly, which they did because she had measured one of his other gloves with a piece of string when he had left it at her house the week before. Clara leaned over to Susanna after Harvey had gone to refill his plate and said, in a tone of someone rendering a verdict that has been long deliberated, "He is exactly right for you. I have never been more certain of anything." "I know," Susanna said quietly. "Does he know that you know?" "He is working toward knowing," Susanna said, and smiled in a way that she suspected was transparent because Clara laughed softly and patted her arm. January came with hard cold and snow, and life contracted to its winter essentials. Harvey continued at the smithy and continued working on the house when weather allowed, and continued his evenings at Susanna's parlor, and there was between them now a warmth that had stopped being tentative and become simply comfortable, which is a deeper thing than tentative warmth, the warmth of two people who have settled into each other without losing the current that runs between them. He borrowed a fifth book and a sixth. The sixth was a collection of poems by Emily Dickinson, which Susanna had been slightly uncertain about lending him because the poems were intimate and strange, and not everyone had the patience for them, and she was protective of them in the way she was protective of things she loved completely. He came back 2 weeks later with the Dickinson pressed full of winter flowers, dried grasses and seed heads, and the papery remnants of late-season blooms that had survived the cold in sheltered places, small and delicate and somehow exactly right for those poems, and he sat across from her and said, "She understood something I've never seen written down before, about how the big feelings are the ones that have to stay quiet, because saying them out loud changes them, and sometimes the only honest thing to do is to press them between pages and hope someone reads them right." Susanna looked at the winter-pressed flowers in the Dickinson, and then at Harvey Cooper, and felt the full, clear, unmistakable weight of loving him settle into her like the final piece of a foundation. "I read them right," she said. He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, and something shifted in his face, moved past the careful and into the open, and he said, "Susanna, I love you. I have been trying to say that in flowers and borrowed books for 4 months, and I think I need to say it plainly. I love you too," she said. "I have known it since before the first book came back." "Then I need to ask you," he said, and he stood from his chair and came around the table, and she stood too because the moment required it, required both of them on their feet and facing each other in the small, bright room. "I need to ask you if you'll be my wife. I have the land and the house isn't finished yet, but it will be by spring, and I know what I'm offering isn't grand, but it comes with everything I have and everything I intend to be in." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I was still talking." "Yes," she said again, smiling. "I heard enough. The answer is yes." He cupped her face in his hands, those large, careful hands that were gentle with horses and with books and with pressed flowers, and he kissed her for the first time, and she thought about all the small, patient things that had led to this moment, the flowers on every page, the early morning rides to creek banks, the deliberate honesty of a man who could not say his feelings out loud and had found another language for them, and she kissed him back with every bit of the love she had been accumulating since August. They were engaged in January, and they were married in April. The wedding was held on a Saturday at the end of April 1880, at the church on the hill, with Reverend Marsh officiating and Clara Whitfield standing up as Susanna's attendant and Luther Grady standing up for Harvey. The whole town came, because Caldwell was the kind of town that came to weddings, and Roy Dupree sat in the third row with his wife and cried, though he would have denied it vigorously to anyone who asked. Mrs. Eugenia Fitch wore her best hat and sat in the second row with the expression of a woman whose instincts have been entirely vindicated. Susanna wore her mother's dress, which had been kept in a cedar chest for 20 years and which she had altered to fit her, and she carried a small bouquet of prairie wildflowers, the same kind as the ones Harvey had pressed into the first book, chosen deliberately, and gathered that morning at dawn from the fields along the creek. Harvey met her at the altar in a dark suit that he had purchased in Wichita and a white shirt that was perfectly pressed, and when he saw her coming down the aisle his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face, love and relief and joy in plain sight, nothing held back. The vows were the traditional words and they said them clearly, and Harvey slid a plain gold band onto her finger that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita along with the suit, and Susanna felt the cool weight of it settle around her finger and thought, "This is it. This is the life I am beginning." And it felt not like an ending or a transformation, but like the full arrival of something that had been on its way for a very long time. The reception was at the town hall, because everything important in Caldwell happened at the town hall, and there was food and music and dancing, and Harvey danced with more confidence than he had at the October dance because they had practiced, in her parlor on winter evenings, dancing together to the music she hummed, and he was still not elegant but he was joyful, and joy in dancing matters more than elegance. Clara made a toast that was funny and warm and made everyone laugh, and Luther Grady made a toast that was brief and earnest and made Susanna's eyes fill. And Harvey thanked everyone who had offered him a place in their town and their community, and said that he had arrived in Caldwell not knowing what he was looking for, and that it had turned out to be simpler and more specific than he had imagined. It had turned out to be one woman on a quiet street who had offered to share her books. They went home to the house at the end of the day, the house on the 80 acres 4 miles north of town that Harvey had spent the winter making into a home. He had finished it in March, and Susanna had been there many times in the final stages, choosing where things would go and adding her own touches. Her father's books on the new shelf Harvey had built specifically for them, the shelf deep enough for the thickened spines of the books pressed full of flowers, the curtains she had sewn from fabric she ordered from Wichita, the braided rug from the general store. It was a small house and a well-made one, and the porch looked out over the creek and the fields, and in the last of the April light when they came home to it as husband and wife, it looked exactly like the beginning of something long and good. They sat on the porch in the mild spring evening, and Harvey made coffee in the kitchen and brought it out, and they sat together in the quiet, listening to the creek and the nightjars beginning their calling as the dark came in, and Susanna leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they were neither of them inclined to speak for a long time. "We have 43 books," Susanna said eventually. "I know," Harvey said. "You've borrowed 7 of them and returned them with flowers." "I have 36 more to read," he said, and she could feel the smile in his voice. "That should keep me busy for a while." She laughed, and the sound went out into the spring evening and disappeared into the sound of the creek. Summer came to their farm like a gift, warm and long, and full of the particular pleasure of two people discovering what their daily life together is made of, which is both more ordinary and more extraordinary than either of them had imagined. Harvey rose before the sun every morning, the habit of years on the trail, and Susanna rose not long after, and they had coffee together in the kitchen while the day came in through the east window. And this, Susanna thought, was something she would want for the rest of her life. Just this, the quiet morning and the coffee and the sound of him moving around the house, so completely present in it. She continued teaching through the following school year, and Harvey supported this without reservation, which she had not taken for granted because she knew it was not a given in 1880 in a cattle town in Kansas. Some of the men on the town council still found the arrangement unusual, a married woman teaching school, but Harvey had been pleasantly immovable on the subject when it arose. "She's the best teacher this town has had," he said, in the flat and final way that his opinions sometimes came out, and since Luther Grady and Roy Dupree both agreed, the council had moved on. In the autumn of 1880, Susanna discovered she was expecting. She told Harvey on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen with the same directness with which she told him everything, and he went still for a moment with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and then set it down very carefully, and looked at her with the full quality of his attention, and then crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and held her with the particular careful intensity of a man who has been given something he would not have known how to ask for. The baby was born in June of 1881, a healthy boy who arrived early in the morning, with the light coming through the bedroom window and the meadowlarks already busy in the fields. They named him Elias James Cooper, Elias for Susanna's father and James for no one in particular, but because Harvey said it sounded like a man who would do things, and Susanna agreed. He was a good baby, by which she meant he was a baby with the usual terrors and sweetnesses, the sleepless nights and the first smile and the extraordinary weight of him in her arms, the way he smelled, and the way he looked at her with his father's quality of attention, already beginning to show through the general newness of infancy. Harvey with the baby was one of the things Susanna put in the category of things she would remember with exactness when she was old. He handled Elias with the same careful confidence he had with horses and with books and with pressed flowers, the large hands gentle and certain. And he talked to him with the same interest and attention that he talked to everyone, as though the baby were a full person whose opinions were worth soliciting, even if he wasn't yet in a position to give them. He sang to him sometimes in the evenings old trail songs that he said the cattle had probably preferred to silence, and the singing was not technically accomplished, but was real and warm, and Susanna listened from the other room and felt the fullness of her life around her. Elias grew. He grew in the fast and astonishing way that children grow when they are well-fed and well-loved and surrounded by a world that is interesting. And by his second year, he was a person in miniature with a distinct personality, curious and deliberate, and with a streak of stubbornness that Harvey said came from his mother and Susanna said came from his father. He loved the animals, particularly the horses, and Harvey had him up in the saddle before he could walk steadily on his own, which seemed to Susanna like the beginning of a very long argument she was going to lose. The town of Caldwell grew too, as the cattle trade continued to bring money and people in through the early 1880s. The Chisholm Trail was still active, though there was talk of fencing and railroads changing things, and Caldwell was at the southern end of Kansas collecting the traffic and the commerce. Harvey had expanded beyond the smithy into the care and training of horses as a specific business, because the gift he had always had with animals had found its proper expression, and ranchers and townspeople brought him horses that no one else had been able to manage, and he managed them, always with patience and without cruelty, and his reputation spread in the way good reputations spread, by word of the people who had been helped. He was, Susanna thought, a man who had found his right life. There was a settled quality to him that had not been there in the beginning, not dissatisfaction replaced by satisfaction, but something more like potential that had found its form, water that had found its proper channel, and now moved with ease. She borrowed books from her own shelf sometimes. That is to say, she would take a book down and page through it and find herself looking at the flowers, at the 7 books pressed full of the record of Harvey's early feeling for her. The wildflowers from the first book, the book he had borrowed before he had found the words, the prairie gold and the wood sorrel and the ironweed, the autumn flowers of the second, the winter grasses of the Dickinson. She could tell each set apart by season and by the slight differences in how he had pressed them, learning as he went. The later ones pressed more evenly and carefully than the first ones, a man improving a skill he had invented for a specific purpose. She loved every imperfect one of them. Elias discovered the books at around age 3, which is to say he discovered that the books on the low shelf in the parlor contained things between their pages, and brought this discovery to his parents with the outraged and delighted energy of a child who has found a secret. Susanna sat with him on the floor and showed him each flower carefully, explaining what it was and where it grew, and what its name was from the book Harvey had given her at Christmas in 1879. The Natural History of Kansas Plants, and Harvey sat in his chair watching this with the expression that Susanna knew meant he was feeling something large and was not immediately going to find words for it. Later that night, after Elias was asleep, Harvey said, "I had a thought." "Tell me," she said. "When Elias is old enough, I'd like to take him out to the creek bank where I found the first flowers," he said, "the little yellow ones in the book you lent me. I'd like to show him where they grow and why they were important." Susanna set down the sock she was mending and looked at him. "Harvey Cooper," she said. "I know," he said, with the small private smile that had always been one of his most specifically lovely qualities. "We will do exactly that," she said. They did it the following summer, when Elias was 4 and fully capable of riding in front of his father on the big chestnut horse named General. And Harvey took them out on an August morning, the anniversary of the month he had first arrived in Caldwell, to the bend in Cow Creek, where the cottonwoods came close over the water, and the banks were covered in the small yellow flowers with the dark centers. The same ones that were pressed 3 pages from the end of the Washington Irving volume on the parlor shelf. Elias crouched at the bank with his father's serious attention already showing in his face and picked one of the small flowers and held it up. "Pretty," he said. "That's the first flower that told your mama I loved her," Harvey said. "Before I had the words, I used flowers." Elias considered this with the thoroughness of a child processing a complex idea. "Did she understand?" "She did," Harvey said. "She understood everything I meant before I managed to say it." "Because she is smart," Elias said, with the confidence of a child who considers this to be established fact. "Because she is," Harvey agreed. Susanna was standing a little apart, watching the two of them, and she felt the morning around her, and the sound of the creek and the meadowlark in the cottonwoods that was, she was certain, the same meadowlark Harvey had heard on the first morning he had come here and gathered flowers, which was not possible but which felt true. And she thought about her father's books, and the pressed flowers in every page, and the plain gold ring on her finger, and the boy crouching at the creek bank, holding a small yellow flower up to the light to see through it. She thought about what it meant to be loved by a man who had no words for it at first, who had found flowers instead, who had ridden out in the early mornings to creek banks and meadows to collect the small, beautiful things of the world and bring them to her between pages. It meant, she thought, that the love was real before the language for it existed, that it had been present and working and finding expression, while it was still forming itself into something that could be spoken. That was not a common kind of love. That was the kind that was already true when it was still growing. In the spring of 1883, their second child arrived. Another boy, and they named him Louis Thomas Cooper. Louis for no one either of them could account for except that it suited him, and Thomas because Harvey had a particular affection for the apostle in the Bible who required evidence before he would believe, which Harvey said was a quality he respected. Louis was born with a head of red gold hair that turned heads in the first weeks of his life, and a disposition that was fundamentally different from his brother's, quick and loud and enthusiastic, where Elias was deliberate and quiet, and watching the two of them together was one of the ongoing pleasures of Susanna's life. How two people could come from the same parents and the same house and be so entirely themselves. Elias was devoted to his brother in the way of older siblings who take their seniority seriously, and Harvey was devoted to both of them in the way that Susanna had known he would be from the moment she had seen him crouch down to talk to Pete Harmon's horse at eye level, because a man who takes the trouble to see things from the perspective of those he is caring for is a man who will be a good father. The years did what years do. They passed with the combination of ordinary days and extraordinary moments that makes a life, and Caldwell grew and changed, and the Chisholm Trail did eventually give way to the railroad, and the cattle trade shifted. But Harvey's horse business was solid by then and growing, and the land along the creek was theirs, and the house had been added to twice, a larger kitchen and a room for each of the boys. And the parlor shelf had been extended to accommodate not just the 43 books from Elias Harper's original library, but the many books that Harvey had continued to add over the years, buying them from the bookseller in Wichita when his business allowed. He had never stopped pressing flowers into books, not borrowed ones, now that the shelf was theirs together, but he had found other occasions for it. On their first anniversary, he had given her a copy of Tennyson pressed full of spring wildflowers. On Elias' first birthday, he had pressed flowers into a children's book, small ones, delicate ones, and the book had become Elias' most prized possession in his first years. On the anniversary of the day Susanna's father had died, Harvey had, without being asked, gone out to the creek and brought back a flower, a single pressed wildflower placed inside the cover of one of Elias Harper's own books, one of the original 43, and given it to her without a word. Susanna had held that book and felt both the grief and the deep gratitude of it, gratitude that the man beside her understood what love required, which was sometimes not words and not grand gestures, but only the small, specific, carefully chosen things that told a person they had been seen. In 1884, Susanna finished the teaching year in June and did not renew her position in the fall, not because she had been asked to stop, and not because she no longer loved teaching, but because there was enough to do on the farm and with the children and with Harvey's growing business, enough in the life she had made, and she had found other ways to keep her father's belief in learning alive. She ran a small reading group on Thursday evenings for the women of the town who wanted it, women who had come west with their families and found themselves isolated from the libraries and lecture halls they had known. And it was popular and lively and full of the kind of disagreement that good books produce. And Susanna ran it with the same patient firmness that had made her a good teacher. Harvey attended when he could, sitting at the edge of the group as the only man, listening with his particular quality of attention and speaking when he had something specific to say. And the women of the group had all been mildly skeptical of his presence at first, and had all, by the third or fourth meeting, simply accepted him as part of the furniture of the thing, because he was good company and good at the kind of listening that makes a conversation better. Their boys grew up beside the creek and in the fields, and in the stable with the horses, and in the parlor with the books. Elias at 10 was already reading the books on the shelf with Susanna's guidance, beginning at one end and working through, and Harvey took him fishing in the mornings the way he used to ride alone to collect flowers, and the two of them would come back with fish, and with long, easy silences between them, the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill every moment, which Elias had from his father entirely. Louis at 7 was louder and more immediate, interested in the horses with an intensity that gratified Harvey, and he was learning to ride properly, and could already help with the feeding and the brushing with a thoroughness that surprised people who underestimated him because of his cheerful noise. One evening in the autumn of 1886, Harvey and Susanna sat together on the porch after supper as they often did, in the cool of the evening with the sky going from gold to indigo, and the boys inside doing their lessons, and Harvey was quiet in a particular way that Susanna had learned to read as a man turning something over. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "The first morning I came here," he said, 8 years ago this August, more or less. I drove 900 head of cattle up from Texas, and I delivered them, and I paid my men, and I looked at the town, and something just," he paused. "Something said stay. I didn't know why at the time. I thought it was tiredness. The trail gets into you after enough years and you start wanting the opposite of it." He looked out at the fields going dark in the evening. "But it wasn't tiredness. I can see that now." "What was it?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "I think the world has a way of knowing what a person needs before they do," he said. "I think I came into Caldwell needing something I didn't have a name for yet, and the name turned out to be you." Susanna set her hand on his arm. They had been married 6 years, and the quality of his attention when he looked at her had not diminished by a degree, had only deepened, and she found this to be one of the truest things she knew about love, that the right kind of it doesn't wear thin with time but accumulates, becomes more itself, the way a river cut deeper by its own passage. "Do you know what I was doing the first morning you came into Caldwell?" she said. "Tell me." "I was sitting at my father's desk in the schoolhouse going over the reader exercises for the new term," she said, "and I was thinking that the year ahead looked exactly like the year that had just ended, and the year before that, and that I was not unhappy about this because I loved my work, but that I had a feeling like something was missing. Not anything I could point to, just a feeling." He looked at her. "And then the next week," she said, "you came into the mercantile asking for books, and the feeling went away. And I didn't notice that it went away until I was standing in my kitchen making coffee for a stranger who had walked me home, thinking, oh, it's this. This is what was missing." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed them against her knuckles, a gesture he had always had, quiet and specific and entirely his own. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know I know what that means, not just the word." "I know you know," she said. "You showed me before you had the word." The autumn deepened and the year turned toward winter and then opened again into spring, the way it always did, the way it would keep doing, and the farm was there and the boys were there, and the books were on the shelf and the horses were in the stable. And Susanna Harper Cooper, who had been a woman alone with her father's library and a school full of children and a particular loneliness she had been careful not to name too loudly, was none of those things alone any longer. There was a morning in the spring of 1887 that she came to think of later as one of the perfect mornings, by which she did not mean a morning without difficulty or complication, but a morning in which she was fully aware of what she had, aware of it in the specific and present way that people usually only manage to be when looking back. She was in the kitchen baking bread, and the window was open because the morning was warm, and the smell of the fields was coming in, the new grass and the creek water, and the distant sweetness of something blooming. And she could hear Harvey in the stable talking to a horse he was working with, the low, even murmur of his voice that she had heard 1,000 mornings and never grown tired of. And the boys were somewhere in the fields because Lewis had found something interesting, and Elias was being pulled along to look at it, despite his preference for being indoors with a book, and she could hear the intermittent sounds of their disagreement about this. She was standing at the kitchen table working the bread dough, and she thought, "This is it. This is the whole of it. The bread and the window and the voice in the stable and the boys arguing in the field and the spring morning and the life that has accumulated around her the way all real things accumulate, slowly and honestly, and full of the particular textures of what is specifically true." She went to the parlor shelf that evening, after supper and after the boys were settled, and she took down the Washington Irving, the first book she had ever lent to Harvey Cooper on an August day in 1879, and she opened it and paged slowly through, looking at the flowers. 8 years had dried and deepened them, the colors slightly faded but the shapes entirely preserved, each one still exactly what it had been, the prairie gold and the wood sorrel and the ironweed and the little yellow flowers from Cow Creek, and the poem and the history and the sentences pressed between them like love that has found a form it can keep. Harvey came into the parlor and saw her there with the book open, and came and stood behind her and looked over her shoulder at the page she was on, one of the yellow flowers, 3 pages from the end. "You're looking at the creek ones," he said. "I always come back to these," she said. "These are the ones that started everything." He put his arms around her from behind, reading over her shoulder, the way they had read together so many times, and she leaned back against him and the firelight moved over the page and the flowers that were 8 years old and still held their shape. "Should I press more flowers?" he said. "I still ride out to the creek." "You press flowers every time you give me a book," she said. "The shelf is full of them." "There are more books to buy," he said. "More mornings to ride out." She turned the page and there was another flower, pale pink, wild phlox from the first summer, still perfectly preserved. "Then press more flowers," she said. "Fill every book on the shelf. Fill every book we haven't bought yet." "That could take the rest of my life," he said. "That's the idea," she said. He laughed softly, and the sound of it went into the room and into the evening and into the life they had made together, solid and warm and fully present, not a thing half done or left unfinished, not a single thread left hanging in the air. The boys were in their beds, and the horses were in the stable, and the bread had been baked and eaten, and the school term would begin again in September, and the creek would run clear through the summer, and the fields would grow what they grew, and the morning would come tomorrow with Harvey's voice in the stable, and the coffee on the stove, and the books on the shelf with their pressed flowers between the pages. Every page a record, every flower a sentence in the language that had spoken first. In 1888, the last great year of the Chisholm Trail before the Kansas quarantine laws and the spread of barbed wire fencing changed the cattle trade forever, a young cowboy came through Caldwell trailing a herd north, a boy of maybe 19 named Will Sasser who had dust in his hair and hunger in his face, and he stopped at the smithy to have a shoe replaced on his cutting horse. Harvey did the work, and when he noticed the boy eyeing the sandwich that Harvey had brought for his lunch, he gave it to him, and when the boy tried to pay for the shoe, Harvey said the shoe was on the house if the boy would tell him about the trail south of the territory line. Well, Sasser, fed and easy, described the trail with the vividness of a young man who had only recently learned how to look at things and was still amazed by what he saw. And Harvey listened with the complete attention of a man for whom those roads were a kind of home he had left, and asked the boy the kind of questions that told Will Sasser, clearly and without being said, that the man before him had once ridden everything he was describing. "You drove cattle?" Will asked. 11 years, Harvey said. "Came up this trail 9 times. Why'd you stop?" Harvey looked out the smithy door at the street, at the town that was his now, his land and his house and his wife and his boys and his horses and his neighbor and his community. All of it accumulated from the moment he had walked into a mercantile and asked Gerald Tuck for a book and been answered by a woman with flour on her hands and 43 books on her shelf. "Found something better," he said. Will Sasser looked at the settled certainty of the man across from him, the ease of someone who is exactly where they ought to be, and nodded with the respect of youth for something it recognizes as wisdom even if it cannot yet name it. "How'd you know it was better?" he asked. "She lent me a book," Harvey said, "and when I brought it back I put a flower on every page, and she smiled at me like I'd said the most important thing she'd ever heard." He paused. "After that I knew." Will Sasser took his horse and his paid debt and his shod hoof and rode back to the herd and the trail and the horizon, the way young men do when the next thing is still out there ahead of them and the present thing is still becoming. Harvey watched him go and then went back to his work, and that evening he walked home to the farm 4 miles north of Caldwell, and the spring air was warm and the creek was running full from the winter snow melt, and the fields were green with new grass, and the house was lit, and Susanna was on the porch with a book in her hands, having come outside to read in the last of the light. She looked up when she heard him coming, and the expression on her face when she saw him had not changed substantially from the expression she had worn the night he had come to her door with the Washington Irving full of flowers, that particular quality of warmth and welcome that he had ridden home to every evening for 7 years and would, he understood with complete and settled certainty, ride home to for the rest of his life. He came up the porch steps and kissed her forehead and sat down beside her in the other chair, and she turned her book toward him so he could see which one she was reading, one of the originals, the Longfellow, and when he took it from her and opened it, he could see the pressed flowers on every page, the autumn ones from the second time he had borrowed it, still there after all the years, still precisely themselves. Elias came to the porch door to say that Lewis had knocked over the water pitcher, and the floor needed mopping, and also that he wanted to know if the word philanthropy was in the dictionary, because he had read it in his book and couldn't find it. And Harvey said he would come help with the floor in a minute, and yes, it was in the dictionary. And Elias went back inside with the efficiency of a boy who has gotten the answers he came for. Harvey sat with the Longfellow in his lap, and the evening around them and Susanna beside him with her shoulder against his, and he turned the pages slowly, looking at each pressed flower, each small piece of a morning 8 years ago when he had ridden out to fields and creek banks and come back with his hands full of the world's small beautiful things because he had not yet found the words. He had found the words now. He said them regularly and meant them fully. But he kept the flowers too, kept them pressed in the books and kept riding out in the mornings to find new ones, because some things are worth saying twice, in every language available to you. Because love that has been said in flowers before it was said in words knows something about itself that late-arriving love cannot, which is that it was real before it was spoken, that it existed in the quiet, careful action of a man rising before the sun and riding 4 miles to a creek bank, because there was a woman who deserved the small, beautiful things of the world brought to her in the only way he knew how to bring them. The last light went out of the sky and the stars came up, the same stars that had been there over every night of the Chisholm Trail, the same stars that had been there the night Harvey Cooper had looked at a Kansas cattle town and felt something say stay. And Susanna Harper Cooper closed her eyes for a moment, and listened to the creek and the night birds and the sound of her sons inside the house and the quiet breathing of her husband beside her, and felt the full completed weight of a life that had been built from an offered book and a borrowed one, from pressed flowers and plain words, and the particular miracle of two people who had found each other in the right season and stayed. The morning would come, as mornings do, and with it the coffee and the bread and the boys and the horses and the work that was also the life. And on the shelf inside the house the books stood with their flowers pressed between them, every page a record of everything that had led to this, complete and whole and fully said, nothing left out, nothing left undone, the whole story there in the pages of 43 books and the many that had come after, pressed full of the small beautiful things of a Kansas plain in summer and autumn and winter and spring, an ongoing record kept by a man who had learned that some kinds of love begin in flowers before they find their words, and that both the flowers and the words, once given, are permanent as the pressed and dried petals between pages, holding their shape across all the seasons that come after. Here, on the porch of their own farm, in the full and settled evening of a life that had been made with care and patience and an extraordinary amount of wildflowers, Harvey Cooper put his arm around his wife, and Susanna Cooper leaned her head against his shoulder, and the creek ran and the stars turned, and the years continued their good work, and nothing was missing, and nothing was left to say, and everything was exactly as it ought to be.